Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Occlusio Natural Processed Kenya from Coffea Circulor. And there's the bag right there. And Coffea Circulor, based out of Arendal, Norway. And this coffee was a suggestion to us by our good friend Ramin. So shout out to and thank you to Ramin for the suggestion. Now, there are a lot of background notes pertaining to this coffee, so let me try to run through those as quickly as possible. First things first, there will be a fair bit of Coffea Circulor content on this channel over the next month or so, as we had a couple of direct suggestions to us from Ramin. But in addition to that, there's a project that Coffea Circulor is working on that definitely caught my interest and I felt was very much worth discussing. But Coffea Circulor is definitely no stranger to this channel, having previously reviewed their Ruby Batian last year, which to this moment still remains my favorite natural processed Kenyan coffee that we've ever reviewed on this channel. But in addition to that, they featured in both of our Cafe Box Advent Calendar series, as well as most recently the Battle of the Tomato, where they took home first place out of 5 pretty notable coffee roasters on that table. And it was after that video that we got a lot of inquiries about this coffee roaster, and they're doing some very interesting projects, including this one right here. So a little bit of background context. Last year's Ruby Batian caught a lot of people's interest for being an isolated Batian variety. And for those that don't know, most Kenyan coffees tend to be a field mix of the SL28, SL34, the Riru variety, and the Batian variety. So isolating those varieties on their own produced some very interesting results, and it's something that I have been a strong proponent of, as I believe that the future of coffee isn't from experimental processing methods, but rather trying out and experimenting with the varieties themselves. This one right here is an isolated Riru variety, and it's the first time I've ever seen a coffee roaster doing that, and that's something that definitely caught my interest, as last year's Ruby Batian definitely opened my eyes to the potential you could have from isolating one of these varieties. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happened with this coffee, as this right here is day 30. And Coffea Circulor does have a brew guide on their website, which is a 15:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 93 to 95 degrees Celsius. And this one was, as you'd imagine, a little robust for me, so I liked to keep this one a little toned down at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 93 degrees Celsius. And I like this one best through the V60, which will indicate a more medium fine grind. Coffea Circulor is a Nordic Light for the roast profile. With those things out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 14. First impression, and the aroma of the coffee is initially quite strong. Modern natural characteristics is it has a little bit more of that robust cherry characteristic to it right from the start. Initial impressions were on the cleaner side of the expectations. It's a natural processed Kenyan. I fully expected it to be quite murky. However, it was mostly in moderation, as you're getting a strong herbality with a slight boozy aspect and a citric finish. Again, all kind of in this moderation. So it left an okay first impression, and much like the Ruby Batian last year, it took a little time for me to get a footing with the coffee, so I fully expected that to be the case with this one as well. Day 15. Run through the Chemex, and not much of an improvement, as the cup has an added fair bit of cherry graininess to it, which has been a very common aspect of a lot of natural processed coffees in general, especially the Colombians. But it's a heavily robust coffee that finishes off into a much more citric tropical fruit that was, for me, reminiscent of an unripened pineapple, and still a little bit of that fermented aspect, which I get a lot more of that through the Chemex, which is kind of surprising. But as mentioned, Chemex can sometimes heighten certain profiles of coffees, and I think that it just kind of highlighted the fermentiness. It does that a lot with natural processed coffees in general. Day 17, continuing to have difficulty understanding what the cup of coffee is going for, as it continues to feel very robust. And I think I determined at this point that I can't really drink this coffee after brew or at the warmer temperatures, because it just kind of comes off a little bit more of that one-dimensional, heavier, natural processed coffee. And it needs a little bit more time to settle, and I couldn't figure out if maybe this was just a little bit more rest or if I needed some pretty heavy adjustments to the recipe. But up to this point, I'd been using either our standard recipe or Coffea Circulor's recipe, so it was going to need to be some pretty significant adjustments. And day 19, the best results I had had to this point was from lowering those temperatures. That's why I definitely liked it on that lower side of that 93 degrees on their brew guide. And I was seeing some significant improvements, as once you let the coffee cool down, and I'm talking a very deep cool down, up to the point where it's maybe just slightly above room temperature, maybe even room temperature, you're getting a lot more of the herbality that they're listing on it. And that was an impression I took away from the first time trying it, and it's an impression that I continue to take away from this coffee, especially after the cool down. They have, I believe, a hibiscus and a cola flavor note list on here, which oftentimes kind of insinuates herbality. And this was a lot better, and I could definitely see those notes as I'm getting a lot more complexity from this coffee. Day 21, noted that again, as the coffee needs a fair bit of time to cool down, and it really tones down a lot of that sort of boozy, fermenty, cherry, grainy aspect that comes from the coffee in its initial stages. It was initially described to me by Ramin as two different coffees, and that's very true. That's very true with a lot of natural processed coffees. This one's a little bit more different in that aspect, though, for a specific reason I'll get to a little later. But it cools off into a much more delicate, slightly complex citric and herbal cup of coffee. Again, better, seeing improvements, so we're continuing on to day 22. So we ran it through the V60 and was continuing to get pretty similar results to the Chemex with significantly less of that fermenty aspect, and I've kind of touched on that already. But the cup has just improved with time in general, as it wasn't as boozy now as it had been through the earlier stages, and I didn't know where this coffee was going to go, if it was going to continue to get more boozy or if it was maybe going to dissipate a little bit more with time, but we kind of figured out that it was just toning down a little bit in general. Day 26 was having a little bit of consistency issues, especially with this being the last day, as it continues to remain on the slightly fermenty side of things, especially at the higher temperatures. The importance of the cool down is really important, as once it does cool down all the way to that really low temperature, it becomes, well, pretty red fruit dominant still, but it has this sort of spirit-like feel to it, and that's what kind of separates it from a lot of the other coffees. Is you can't have two different coffees a lot of the time when you drink a coffee. This one right here just had, it felt like a spirit when you were drinking it, and on our tasting wheel it has the body profiles, and there's nothing that's overly spirit-like, with the exception, there's nothing overly spirit-like on there, but for the most part, the experience has been very winey, which can be a little heavier, but this has been a little bit more light and delicate, and something that we'll see in the tasting wheel. But yeah, the cool down can't be emphasized enough, as it's just really imperative and important for this coffee. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. Right, 4 level 4s, let's run through those real quick. The finish, level 4. That's actually kind of a big deal, because most of these coffees have been overbearing and too robust. So having that at the level 4 mark is already off to a positive. The acidity, level 4, I mean, it's no surprise whatsoever. It's a natural processed Kenyan, and it is a lighter profiled coffee, so of course I was going to be on the higher side of things. The florality was probably the most distinct flavor profile for me, and that hibiscus that they have listed on here, definitely the most pronounced, so it's definitely justified there at that level 4 mark, and it's in almost equal abundance as the red fruit. So the berry is up there, so thinking those kind of more strong berry characteristics that are very common in natural processed coffees these years. And then the savoriness at the level 3 mark. It's kind of mentioned, it's a very herbal florality to this cup of coffee, so it definitely is justified there. Sweetness level 3, that's kind of an interesting one, because I feel like this coffee skews a little bit more on the spirit side of things as opposed to the super sweet side of things. So that one right there is interesting in itself, being at that level 3 mark. But the rest of the tasting wheel, I think the only thing I really want to discuss is the body and the cleanliness. So the cleanliness, level 2, especially at those higher temperatures, it's a little bit of a murky cup of coffee, as I feel like you would expect from something like a natural processed Kenyan coffee. So that's not too surprising. Even with the cool down, even with a little bit more clarity, I don't think I could justify it above the level 2 mark. The body is the really interesting one, as I feel like that's what really differentiates this coffee from a lot of its contemporaries. This one right here, as mentioned, has a much more spirit-like feel to it in general. So it's on the lighter side of things because it is a lighter spirit on there. I think they have bourbon listed as the flavor note, and that would make a lot of sense, and I could see that, but I feel it in the body as well. It could just be the priming effect, but I definitely feel it in the body. Other than that, tasting wheel I feel like looks pretty accurate for this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. It was an interesting coffee, to say the least, but I feel like most people will know that none of it necessarily skewed in the direction that is my sort of preference, as even the nicer flavors that I was able to get from it typically aren't the flavors I go for in coffees. And on one side of things, you had a cup of coffee that I really have been strongly opposed to for a very long time, as I felt that they've been overdone at this point. And on the other side, you had a cup of coffee that was unique, but not something that I'm necessarily the biggest fan of. So I don't think it'll come as a huge surprise that this one wasn't necessarily my favorite coffee. And I can see a lot of the positives, and I continue to believe strongly that we should continue to work with these varieties on their own and continue to experiment with the varieties themselves as opposed to the processing methods, because this right here does demonstrate that they can have their own unique aspects without fiddling around with the processing method too much. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. I feel like, once again, if you like your spirits, this has a fair bit of spirit complexity. It does have a lot more of that boozy aspect at the warmer temperatures, and it does have a different, more unique boozy aspect at the cooler temperatures, with a fair bit of robust fruits in it as well. So I know a lot of people have been raving about these coffees in general, and I think this one, as I've kind of noted throughout this video, definitely is different from the rest. By far. Those other ones I didn't enjoy anywhere near as much as this one. This one's on the better side of these natural processed Kenyan coffees for me. Even then, it's not necessarily my favorite drink, but I can imagine a lot of people would really enjoy what this one is going for. For the most part, I think I'll leave this review at that. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I would love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Occlusio Natural Processed Kenya from Coffea Circulor. Thank you for watching.